Hello, it's Aaron Renn. My guest today needs no introduction for most of you. He's Ross Douthat, a columnist for the New York Times, and he's also, for the purposes of our discussion today, the author of a new book called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, available from Zondervan. There's a link to buy that in the show notes. Ross, thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me.
What I thought was really interesting about this book is you are a devout Catholic. But this book does not make the case for becoming a Catholic or even necessarily a Christian. It just says you should have some religion. What made you decide to frame it that way?
So my sense was that we had reached a point in the evolution of American culture or Western culture where organized religion, institutional religion had declined to a point where you have a really big audience out there that might be interested in religion, interested in spiritual ideas, these kinds of things, but has no sort of inherited contact with religious institutions and ideas, and has no sort of foundational sense of why it might be reasonable to adopt a religious posture toward the world. Right. I think there's a very popular idea that I think an idea that's I think become maybe more popular in the last 5 or 10 years as secularism has come to seem a little bit exhausted and unhappy. There's this idea that it would be nice to be religious, right? It would be nice to believe in God. It would be nice to have believe in some sort of, ultimate moral foundation for human life, those kind of things. But religion is this sort of terrain of, irrational, not darkness, maybe, optimism, right? But a terrain of irrationality, I think, is a very common understanding of religion from people who I don't think understand that much about religion at all. So the goal of this book, the initial goal, is to essentially try and lay that foundation and to persuade the curious and the skeptical reader that, in fact, the choice to explore religion, to become religious, to adopt a religious posture toward the world, by which I mean a sort of basic belief in, the possibility of God, cosmic purpose, human exceptionalism, a crucial role for human beings in the cosmos, and some form of supernatural possibility, that adopting that posture is reasonable. And not just reasonable, but I go further. I say, in fact, it is, if you look at the world around us, it is arguably obligatory that a reasonable person experiencing existence should be religious as a default, as opposed to being secular as a default. And that seemed like actually quite enough for an argument. It's not a long book, I think, and it does end with a chapter on my own Christian faith that does effectively make, I'd say, a pitch for Christianity, not for Catholicism per se, but for Christian belief in general. So it is, it's not completely not a work of apologetics, but it seemed to me that sort of initial level of argument, like, here's why not just you should want to be religious, but you should regard it as a serious thing that a reasonable person should be engaged in and interested in. I thought that was enough for a short book, enough of a case to make. It is a kind of, a sort of, for a more decayed culture, right? It's an equivalent of the C.S. Lewis mere Christianity argument. Lewis says, before we get to Catholics versus Protestants versus the Orthodox, let's just figure out why one would be a Christian at all. And I'm saying, okay, well, let's, things have maybe gotten a bit worse since Lewis's time. So let's figure out mere religion, why one should be religious at all. That's the goal.
You mentioned that you see different kinds of people today who are non-religious. So it used to be maybe the non-believer you'd meet is someone who was raised in church, like a classic free thinker type. I'm reacting against religion. I've explicitly rejected Christianity because of all the reasons you would give. And then today it's people who really don't necessarily have as many point of contacts with it.
Yeah.
How does that inform the kind of arguments that you make?
Well, I think there's I mean, I think there's a couple categories of people, right? There are still a lot of people who have some sort of initial experience of religion in their childhood and leave it behind in adolescence or college or their 20s, right? That category obviously has not gone away. Um, but even those people, I think, often because the culture is less Christian, less sort of traditionally religious than it used to be, even those people are often having less exposure to religious ideas and arguments than they would have had in the course of becoming more secular, 50 or 60 years ago. But then, yeah, then I think there's another category of people who, really for one of the first times in American history, who just have not encountered religion in any sort of inherited institutional form. And to me, I think this is actually a kind of obvious opportunity for people who are religious, who think that a religious attitude is a good idea, is even obligatory, to make a case that does not immediately get bogged down in the debates of the culture war and arguments about the Catholic sex abuse crisis or the religious right, or all of these things that are sort of entangled with debates about God and Christianity in American life. And I do touch on some of those issues a little bit in the book, especially in the later parts where the book has a sort of slight self-help element, and I'm sort of saying, okay, here are the stumbling blocks, right? And so one, to becoming religious, and one of them is, why are the major religions so hung up on sex, right? So that's right. So that's in there. But the initial goal of the book is to say, okay, great, you don't have this sense of Christianity or any religion as this sort of inheritance that you have engaged with deeply and then gone beyond. And that means you can come to some of these issues afresh. And I think if you come to some of these issues afresh, I wouldn't have written this the book if I didn't think this. I think the arguments for the basic religious posture are much, much stronger than many secular people think. And I think they're stronger in ways that become apparent if you consider them sort of, again, independent of specific questions about, the place of the Catholic Church in American political life, or these kind of questions. And I mean, to put it in sort of Rennian terms, right? If I may, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there is, you've written a lot about sort of the transition that
Yeah.
American culture has made from a world where people are sort of neutral toward religion to a world where people are sort of self-consciously negative, not towards Christianity, right? Specifically. And I think that there is a landscape slightly beyond the negative, a landscape of sort of ignorance and in a landscape of ignorance, you might say, where maybe people are sort of negative towards some sort of manifestations, or what they think of as manifestations of Christianity, but really in that terrain there is just a lot of people who don't have a strong sense of what where do religions come from?
Right.
Why do people pray? What is this all about? And I think there's an argumentative opportunity there.
Yeah. You mentioned, and I think it's very clear that there's sort of been a renaissance of spirituality in some sense. You think about all the people who are on these ayahuasca trips and psychedelics, and or the belief in UFOs. And as I'm reading your book, I know you're friends with Rod Dreher. I sort of think your book is a little complementary to Rod's in that he's sort of looking at these phenomenons and telling the church it needs to get more spiritual, whereas you're looking at these phenomenon and telling the secular spiritualists they need to get more religious. I think the line you actually have is, it is especially important now to defend not just the spiritual, but the religious, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I think absolutely Rod is onto something in his portrait of both the resilience of what he calls sort of enchantment, right, in the late modern world, and also the various ways in which it's sort of coming back, right? It's sort of creeping back into our culture in various ways, some of them associated with traditional Christianity, some of them very much not. And yes, I think that his portrait of that moment, of our moment, is accurate, but also I think one can, as I do in the book, sort of take the discussion in a slightly different direction and emphasize. I mean, I am emphasizing sort of rationality, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm emphasizing reasoning about the world and the human place in it as a way to help understand and navigate the phenomena that Rod is writing about, right? And again, I think he would agree with this. In fact, he blurbed my book, so
Okay.
presumably we're on the same general page. But Rod is definitely writing about, he's making a kind of argument about like how to open your mind, right? That's part
Right.
of what his book is about. He's saying, here, that there is a kind of lost sense, right, that pre-modern people and early modern people had, that we disenchanted moderns lack. And so there's kind of a knack for becoming open to God that you can cultivate and that culture can support, and we need more of that, right? And I'm saying, before you get to the point of trying to open yourself in this way and cultivate some of the practices that Rod describes, it's good to have a foundation of reasons why you think this pursuit is a good idea. And it's good for two reasons. First, because not everyone who tries to cultivate a spiritual knack and wants to have a personal encounter with God will have exactly the encounter they want, right? And so if you tell people, okay, just practice religion and see what happens, some people are going to do that and become devout Baptists or Lutherans or
Yeah.
Methodists or whatever, right? But some people are going to practice and not get some miraculous sign from God telling them what to do. And those people can then sort of drift back, I think, pretty easily out of religious faith, right? That sort of they feel like, well, I tried it, nothing happened, so I guess I need to go back to the rational, secular, material world.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying the rational, material world tells you that you should keep practicing, even if God has not, decided to grace you with a special favor or some prophetic sign, right? That there are good reasons to be religious that are independent of experience. So that's one reason to have this foundation, and the other one, which again Rod would definitely agree with, right, is that the foundation helps steer and protect you through
Yeah.
a landscape of religious experience that is by no means safe, by no means, friendly in every way to human beings. And this is, again, you don't have to be a Christian to recognize this at all. You don't have to believe in the particulars of Christian cosmology about heaven and hell and demons and so on. You can just read about the kind of experiences that people have when they go out doing spiritual questing on their own, whether it's new age practices or you mentioned psychedelics and ayahuasca and so on. Lots and lots of people have positive experiences, and an important subset of people have really dark, damaging experiences that can redirect their life very much for the worse. And that's just sort of an empirical, whatever the meaning of this is, it's an empirical fact that some religious experience, some spiritual experience seems to be dangerous to the experiencer. And that means that there is real value in having in having a sort of structured institutional view of how people should approach the numinous, the mystical, and the uncanny. And that's part of what I'm arguing for in the book. It's not just about reasons to believe. It also spends a certain amount of time saying, and you should probably join a major faith tradition and not become a spiritual freelancer.
Yeah, yeah. You make the case for what you call the big religions. You consider one of those, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and that's part of, I mean, part of part of my argument with a certain style of atheism, right, is that, you know, there's a kind of atheist or at least skeptical conceit that the landscape of religions presents so much variety and diversity that a person starting out, as I imagine a reader starting out, has just no way of knowing where to go, right? It's like, well, you could be, there's 17 kinds of Presbyterian, right? And there's 113 types of Buddhist, and, you know, there's 16 small cults somewhere in Western Kazakhstan, you know, and 99.9% of them are false. And how could you ever hope to find the one that's true, right? That's a very familiar perspective and line of argument. And I don't think that's true at all. I think, you know, that if you take a religious perspective on the world and assume that, you know, we're here for a reason and the universe is made in some sense for us, then you need to have a little bit of trust in the accumulated wisdom of the human past, some of the convergences that I do think exist between different religions, certainly in their views of morality, but also in aspects of their, you know, metaphysical picture. One of the points I make in the book is that it's not just Christianity. Every religion, every big religion asserts that, you know, you can die and go to a heaven, or you can die and go to a hell. That's something that Buddhists and Hindus, as well as Christians and Muslims, think. Now, the Buddhists and Hindus think that you can then be reincarnated out of that heaven or hell, right? They have a different, a different larger cosmology, but the basic idea that you should be concerned about where you're going after your death, right?
Right.
That is a pretty big religious universal. So you have some universals, some convergences, and yeah, I think, you know, if you have a personal experience with God in some really small boutique religion somewhere, by all means follow that. But I think just starting out and saying, okay, you have, you know, a few big traditions in the world. You know, you have the Abrahamic faiths, you have Buddhism, and you have Hinduism. Like, that's, you know, that's not an impossible list of religions to
Right.
look into and consider. And I think thinking about it that way is much more helpful than sort of making a list of every subgrouping within, you know, within Islam or Christianity and just sort of throwing up your hands. You can simplify the initial point of contact with religion to, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 choices and go from there.
I want to talk about a couple of the kind of cases for religion that you lay out in the book. It's kind of an interesting way to kind of collect many of the stronger arguments for religion and the existence of God in one place. One of them was the sort of called the cosmological defense, which is the idea that the universe is freakishly well designed for human life to exist in a way that is almost impossible that it would ever have happened by chance. The fine-tuning argument. What is that one?
Yeah, that's the. It's not even an argument. It's just to the best of our scientific knowledge, a reality that there is a very, very large, very, very large range of possible calibrations of physical laws and constants and, you know, these kind of things that could form different imaginable universes, right? It's not the case that there is only one or a very narrow range of possible imaginable universes. There are a lot of possible imaginable universes. And the kind of sort of particularities that yield not just a universe structured generally like ours, but a universe that has the features required to create stars, planets, and biological life, right? Before we even get to like human consciousness and these kind of things. The fine tuning involved, or the apparent fine tuning involved, is, you know, you're dealing with probabilities where it's, you know, a 10 to the 25th power, right?
Right.
Kind of range, and, you know, you're winning the most absurd lottery in the history of all possible lotteries in order to get this universe where we exist and are capable of standing up, looking around, and observing it. And this is, one of the points I make in the book in this area and a number of areas, right, is that this is an area where we just know more than our more religious ancestors did about the structure of the universe. And in knowing more, we have better reasons than they did, better scientific reasons to regard this universe as very suspiciously designed seeming for us. So there's a sense that, Copernicus plus Darwin take away reasons to be religious. And I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but certainly Darwinism poses particular challenges to Christian theology. There's no question about that, right? But modern science has given us, I think, new reasons, new serious, substantial reasons to look at the universe, look at our place in it, and think, okay, we're here, this exists for a reason. We're here for a reason. Maybe we are the reason that it all exists.
Yeah,
And
I thought
just go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I thought it was really interesting. You made this point that science was initially seen as disproving these biblical claims because it's like, well, the earth is the center, everything revolves around the earth. And now we know with Copernicus, it's the heliocentric universe. And oh, by the way, the earth is this minor, insignificant planet in this gigantic place. How in the world could all of this universe been created just for us? Doesn't seem very likely. But then you reach a point where actually the more you know scientifically, the more it strengthens the argument.
Yeah. In a curious way, right? Like, obviously there is something cozier and tidier about a medieval world picture where the whole universe consists of, 10 planets, right? And sort of these concentric rings. I'm not doing justice to the actual medieval world picture, but it is a sort of tidier cosmos, right? Than the one that we find ourselves in. And planet Earth is indeed very, very small. And we do not know that we are the only form of life with our capabilities and our consciousness in the universe. This is itself, a separate debate. We do have some good reasons to think that if there are other beings like us, they are not, they're pretty rare. This is the Enrico Fermi's big question of, like, if the universe was filled with conscious beings, where are they? Right? Why would we be the first to start sending signals into space? Why wouldn't space be crowded with signals? But but we are, at the very least, we appear to be the kind of creature that this universe was constructed for. Maybe there are others, maybe C.S. Lewis was right, and Earth is under some kind of divine quarantine because of the fall, right? And there are all these other, species living in greater harmony with God on other solar systems. Who knows, right? But based on what we know, this is a universe that is uniquely rigged to create beings like us. And so our role does seem, if not necessarily central, certainly a lot more central than just saying, like, oh, the universe is really big and we're really small, would lead you to believe.
Yeah, it's not just that there are, like, oh, we now discover there are lots of Earth-like planets out there, or whatever they claim. I'm not quite sure exactly what they've really discovered, but it's like there wouldn't even be planets or stars if this one, the strong nuclear force were 0.0000 infinite number of O's won a different way. We wouldn't even have, like, atoms, which is really crazy to think about.
Yes, and it leads, I should say, obviously, that there is, there are lots of serious scientists and philosophers who are not themselves religious, who have wrestled with these questions. And there are various attempts to make sense of this peculiar cosmic order without recourse to a belief in the divine creator. And I talk a bit about what's ended up as the most popular one, the conceit of the multiverse, which you could say is basically Darwinism for universes, right? It's like, if you have enough universes over a long enough, well, it's not even time bound, but over some sort of horizon that we can't fathom, eventually you get one like ours. And
an infinite number of monkeys creating an infinite number of universes will eventually create ours.
Right? And of course, we aren't there to see any of the others, so of course this one feels special, but isn't, right? And there's I think that argument runs into trouble even on its own terms, that it doesn't actually do away with the question of who's in charge here, right? Because you're still essentially creating, it's like you have this machine that makes universes, right? That is itself still bound by these fundamental laws and forces and powers whose existence itself requires some kind of explanation. But it's also, I don't I don't think that there are infinite universes equal to our own. I can imagine sort of a multiverse as a way of describing possibilities that exist in the mind of God or something like that. But I do think that it is both more sensible and ultimately truer to science as we've known it to assume that this is the primary universe. And I also didn't get into in the book. I thought about writing about the simulation hypothesis, right? Which has become somewhat popular in Silicon Valley. You get, some people will say, Elon Musk. People will say Elon Musk believes in the simulation hypothesis. I'm not sure if he does, right? But this is the view that says, okay, we have all this fine tuning because, at a certain point, civilizations become sufficiently advanced that they can simulate universes, right? And so they're running infinite simulations. And so we're just one of the infinite simulations.
Yeah.
That to me seems to literalize the problem with the multiverse hypothesis, right? Where you're saying literally there's some godlike figure somewhere running all these experiments. Okay, where did where did that godlike figure come from? B, at a certain level, like that, if we were in a simulation run by a godlike creature who is not the god of classical theism, I actually think it probably would make sense to say some prayers to even to that. You sort of land a little bit.
Pray that they don't change the parameters on the simulation.
Well, right.
you've wipe you out.
Right. You've sort of reconstructed a kind of Gnostic cosmology, right? You've got a demiurge who's got us imprisoned in this world of illusion. But that is itself clearly a religious idea. You have not escaped religion by making that move at all. You've just constructed a very peculiar, 4th century AD, 3rd century AD cosmology. Once again.
You also give some arguments from sort of spiritual experience. You talk about miracles. I know we'll talk about miracles, but one of them was just this idea that people have these profound spiritual experiences that they cannot make sense of in any traditional way, including people who are, these are not credulous people. Some of them are the most militant, hardcore atheists, and yet they have experiences that they can't explain away, but don't deny that they have. So one of them, the examples that you give, is a woman named Barbara Ehrenreich, who, she's like a militant atheist, militant leftist. I think she co-founded NARAL, the big abortion rights group, and that's the kind of person she is. And yet she had these encounters and these experiences she couldn't explain. How do people experience? How do those kinds of experiences shape people's perspectives on religion?
Yeah, so Aaron Reich, I don't know if she founded NARAL, but she was certainly active in the pro-choice, pro-abortion movement, and had very left-wing politics. And she wrote a book called Living with a Wild God that chronicled how at various points in her life she had what, if you've read William James or any sort of chronicler of the varieties of religious experience, will be sort of familiar kinds of religious experience. There's the kind that sort of delivers this sense of dissolving boundaries, of oneness with the universe. There's also the kind where you sense this kind of presence, this divine presence, this being that is either sort of palpable to you or entering you or, sort of ravishing you in some way, right? And she had, a bunch of experiences within that range, all unbidden. She wasn't out doing sort of new age rituals. She wasn't a seeker, right? Mm-hmm. Like you have people who are not religious who become spiritual seekers and have those kind of experiences. But Aaron Reich is a case study in how they can happen just, seemingly at random to people who have no belief system at all. And in her case, I think it changed her perspective on the universe in a way that made her someone who I would sort of categorize her as someone who moved from being an atheist to being spiritual but not religious, right? In the sense of sort of believing in spiritual realities, still thinking that the traditional religions were all wrong and that their view of God couldn't possibly capture whatever this was, right? That she had encountered. But part of what's interesting, just if you're sort of doing a kind of anthropology of these experiences, it's clearly the case that, what people are taught about God and what they expect conditions not so much the experience itself as the interpretation, right? The subsequent interpretation. And so you have presumably a large number of people having experiences today that if they had them in, 12th century France or, 17th century Iran or, in some sort of in a sort of religiously specific cultural context, they would say, okay, well, that's just, that's the Holy Spirit, right? Or that's an encounter with the power of a holy saint or something, right? And in our world, they don't know what to do with those experiences. And I've sort of collected over the years, I call them non-conversion stories, right? It's really an interesting genre of people who have these sort of brushes with the numinous, but because of their backgrounds and cultural expectations, they don't know what to do with them. And so they don't exactly do anything with them. It shifts their perspective on the cosmos a bit, but it doesn't shift them into religion. The experiences just sort of stand on their own as unexplained artifacts. And of course, you could argue that that is actually more empiricist in some way, right? You could say, well, the religious person assumes it's the Holy Spirit, but maybe it's not, right? And that argument exists. But I think it's an important thing to understand about, again, sort of what we know now that we didn't know 200 years ago about the persistence of religion and why it persists. If you go back and read David Hume and some other Age of Reason skeptics, you really have the sense that they think that people believe in miracles and divine encounters mostly because there are these, legends and myths handed down and imposed by religious authorities, right? So it's all just Robin Hood and King Arthur, stories from the past, embroidered, turned into dogma, and the people are indoctrinated with them, and that's it. Now, Hume does also say, look, there is some natural human propensity to believe in the marvelous, right? So he wouldn't be completely surprised that stories of miracles persist. But I think there really was an expectation that if you strip away the edifice of belief imposition that organized religion, traditional religion creates, that a lot of religious experience would just sort of dissolve because it wasn't a real feature of human life to begin with. It was just a cultural construction of priests and other religious authorities. And it's just not true. We just sort of know that's not true. And this, again, overlaps a bit with Rod's book, I think. But even Rod, if I were to sort of disagree with him slightly, like he sort of buys in a bit to the idea that modernity has really accomplished some sort of disenchantment. And I don't think that's right. I think that we have disenchanted what I call in the book official knowledge, right? The sort of production of knowledge in universities and book reviews and political magazines, like that is disenchanted. You don't see very many. You see them occasionally, but you don't see many pieces in the New Yorker imagining that like angelic forces are crucial to understanding the trajectory of politics or something.
Right.
But in terms of how people experience the world, I don't see a lot of evidence that mystical experience has actually diminished in some substantial way. It's hard to measure these things, but there's some measures, especially since the 50s, that suggest that if anything, it's increased. a bit, which could make sense, right? That like actually forms of old line religion, maybe especially the sort of frozen chosen mentalities of parts of American Protestantism built stronger walls against mystical experience than a secular world does. Like that actually could be the case, that some forms of institutional religion put up more walls than a world where people don't believe but are sort of more permeable to weird things and weird forces.
You talk in the book about your own personal kind of religious journey or life stories. You were baptized Episcopalian, then you were raised in a very Pentecostal environment for a while, and then you became Catholic. I, interestingly, if you didn't know my story, I was baptized Catholic, raised in a very Pentecostal environment, and became a Presbyterian. So I almost like did that. It's almost like a chiastic structure here. I kind of want to I almost want to get you on a podcast where I just ask about your experience with Pentecostalism and those things. But I'm curious, have you personally experienced any of the spiritual things that you talk about, the miracles or the spiritual kind of experiences?
Not in the strong way of Aaron Reich or, for instance, my own mother, who's I was sort of a participant observer in my parents and especially my mother's sort of religious pilgrimage as a kid. So I watched both of my parents speak in tongues, get slain in the spirit, have all of the experiences that you associate with Pentecostalism. And I thought those experiences were real. I still think they're real, right? I did not become a skeptic by virtue of not having them myself. It was more that I thought these experiences were real, and I was interested in sort of figuring out a clearer system than Pentecostalism had to offer that actually made sense of God's action in the world. But I was not slain in the spirit. I have never spoken in tongues. I've had what I would consider a set of sort of spiritually sort of adjacent to mystical experiences, I think, which I think are quite commonplace, much more vulnerable in turn to sort of secular critique that, you're just sort of looking for patterns in your life and so on. I wrote a book about my experience with Lyme disease that has a few examples of stuff happening more in the realm of sort of strong coincidence, these kind of things, right? But I have never had the kind of overwhelming encounter with God or literally explicit miraculous healing that I talk about in the book. But then in a way, I'm a case study in why it's possible to sort of observe these experiences, watch them happen, read about them, and be, I think, rationally persuaded of their reality without it being something that sort of is emerging organically from my own conscious experience. I'm not sort of invested in defending the validity of my own raptures.
Yeah, so it sounds like, you don't necessarily haven't experienced all these things yourself, but you affirm the validity of at least some of these things as like real phenomenon.
Well, they're certainly real. I mean, there's no question that they're real phenomena in a way that goes, and this is something that's important for people who haven't had any kind of encounter and maybe have watched like a show where it looks like some televangelist is just putting his hands on people's heads and pushing them down onto the floor. I'm sure that happens, right? That was not the kind of experience that I observed. I observed a world of a woman who had some kind of faith healing gift, like pointing at someone across the room, and the person sort of falls down and is on the floor having a mystical experience for the next 10 minutes, like that. Now, is that the work of the Holy Spirit? Definitively no. It could be, it could be some, you could say it could be that people have latent psychic powers, right? That have nothing to do with God. I mean, I think they would have to do with God probably, but let's say, you could say, or that there is some sort of, incredible psychological effect of religious behavior and experience that we just don't understand at all, right? Like you can you can come up with different explanations for those
Right.
things, but the reality of them as something that is not just sort of engineered by charlatans and hucksters is absolutely true. And one point I try and stress in the book a little bit, right, is that with religious experience, I think, with sort of miraculous healings, some of these kind of things, near-death experiences, one of the moves that atheists and materialists make is to say, well, these are just evidence for the remarkable power of the human mind, right? Like the human mind is so powerful that, it's like what seem like miraculous healings are just the placebo effect on steroids, right? Your mind wants to be healed and makes it happen, right? It does something to your body and the cancer goes away. Or your mind near death builds these huge palaces of an afterlife that don't exist, but in your consciousness they do. And to me, like at a certain level, those arguments seem to me indistinguishable from arguments for the supernatural. You were at that point, you were describing a view of human consciousness, which in materialist terms can barely be said to exist, right? It's this, at best, it's this sort of emergent phenomenon of overlapping modalities in the brain. It has no, the materialist view is that has to be that consciousness has no fully independent existence, right? That it is in the end reducible in some way to just patterns of material causation. And yet you are taking this thing that you have downgraded in that sense and upgrading it to like absurd levels of power over not just sort of experiences you might have when you're unconscious, but also over your literal flesh. It's like your consciousness, which does not exist, can also be empowered to heal your body when primed with certain religious signifiers. I mean, okay, but if you think that, I don't know why you don't go all the way to to religion.
Yeah, exactly. The pastor of that Pentecostal church I grew up in experienced, what I would consider miraculous healing from cancer. He got bladder cancer, and it was definitively terminal. All the treatments failed completely. And then basically he essentially donated his body to science. He agreed to allow them to enroll him along with other people who were for sure going to die within 6 months into some experimental chemo drug they wanted to try out. And they're like, this thing, if it works, maybe it'll extend your life 6 months. He took it, and the very first checkup they did after he took the drug, all the cancer was gone from his body, 100% of it, and it never recurred. And everybody else died. And as far as I know, that drug never got approved. And I know there's a sort of thing called a chemotherapy super responder. So it's within the potential realm of science that such a thing could happen. And yet, again, I start looking at the odds. It's a little. It's like, well, you can make choices, or you can accept that like something happened.
Well, and this is where we have inadequate data, right, to make this assertion definitively. But one of the moves that gets made by skeptics is the idea that Michael Shermer, the famous skeptic, uses this phrase a lot. The idea that there's this residua, right? That like, there's always going to be some limit on what science can explain, and there's always going to be residual cases and situations and weirdnesses, and you should expect that as part of the process of science, and you shouldn't take the residua and build your whole faith system on them, right? That's what the skeptic would say. So the skeptic might say, okay, we don't know why the pastor in particular received this healing, but you expect wild outliers that we can't explain. It's part of reality. I think the question is, and I think that the residua that is real, right, tends to cluster around the kind of people who pray for healings and do religious things, right? It's not that no one has ever experienced the radical remission of a cancer without prayer. I don't think that's true. But I do think from my own life experience that, when you are doing religious things and operating in religious settings, that's where you find a lot of the outlying data, you might say. And to me, that's an indicator that there is a connection between the outlying data, I don't have to call it the miraculous, just the outliers, right? And the quest for contact with and harmony with higher powers and our wider role in the universe. Now, I do not have a long study of 500,000 people across 6 continents to prove that case, and maybe one could be done that would disprove it. But that is my strong sense, right? That yes, there is a residual, but it exists even though miracles can happen to anyone and religious experiences can happen to anyone. There is a connection between being an outlier and seeking God, basically having outlying experiences and so on. That is what you would expect if God, in fact, actually existed.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just wrap up with asking about, you address a couple of the objections. And, we didn't go through all the reasons, but we got to give people a reason to buy the book. And again, the book is Believe. There's a link in the show notes. Pick it up. One of them, of course, you would deal with is the classic, the problem of evil. If God is all powerful and all good, how come evil exists in the world? How come bad things exist in the world? And this actually seems to be a hard problem in that, the Bible addresses it multiple times directly, such as in the book of Job. Or you can think of Luke 13, where they asked Jesus about the Galileans who were slain and their blood mixed on the altar. But the Bible never gives us an answer. We don't get an answer. So what do you say? What's your response to the problem of evil?
I mean, I think the Bible offers multiple invitations to wrestle with the problem. And I think if the God of the Bible is real, his desire is for us to be concerned with the problem, it's, you can go all the way back to Abraham arguing with God about whether to spare Sodom, right? And go all the way through the book of Job, where the people who are trying to justify God's ways end up condemned, right? Even though God plays his trump card on Job, he doesn't say your friends were right. He says you were right, but you're still wrong, right? And then you enter the New Testament, where, to me personally, I find the passion narratives, crucifixion, and so on to be a very sort of intuitively appealing response to the problem of evil, where it's like, okay, you have this problem, and God himself has entered into creation and experienced the worst. Anything you experience, God has in some mysterious way experienced as well. But that's not at all a logical proof, right? And I think in its own way, it intensifies the problem for some people, because from their view, it's like, okay, you've got God himself. He's here when he's on earth. He's always healing people. He loves children. He cares about everybody. Like, why does in the everyday he, not heal everybody, right? Like, if Jesus is the revelation of God, shouldn't God, heal every child who ever gets cancer and so on, that kind of thing. So it's a hard problem for a reason. I think it's a really bad reason not to be religious and not to believe in God, right? Because to go from this problem complicates and challenges my relationship with God to this problem invalidates the arguments for God's existence is this incredibly presumptuous move, right? That essentially arrogates to oneself a kind of divine, a sort of divine God level perspective on the entirety of creation, where you're like, well, I can stand outside of all creation and weigh things up in the balance, and I can see that if God was good, he's making some big mistakes here, right?
That was Job. He wanted to put God on trial,
right? Where would you possibly get that perspective if you are not already, an ensouled creation participating in the divine nature to some degree, right? Like I think you have to have a tacitly religious perspective on what human beings are, even to get to the point where you could possibly aspire to pass judgment on Almighty God, right? And like the claim of the materialist that the human being is this jumped up ape enslaved to his biological operations, but also he has figured out that the moral order of the universe is deeply awry and God has failed, right? Or something. I don't think that makes sense. I think it makes more sense to maintain it the way God seems to intend, as a problem to wrestle with, than to use it as a trump card. I think in the there is a I say this in the book, but there is a kind of, an aridity, a sort of dry, coolness to a certain kind of attempt to do theodicy by this calculus, right? Where you say, look, you have to have free will, you have to have the possibility of evil in order for human beings to be independent and not just automatons. I think that's right, but it does seem to sort of fall short a little bit at the doors of Auschwitz, right? Like it's like, okay, but this much evil, do you have to have that?
Right.
But I think the flip side is also true, that there is this weird sense in which the argument about how God would have to be bad to have made the world seems to become more and more popular among people as they experience less suffering. Not always. There are people who experience suffering and lose faith in God. Absolutely, that happens. But if you look at sort of the macro level of like American society right now, the person who tells you that, God doesn't exist because of the problem of evil is much more likely to be a affluent, successful,
Right.
well-educated person experiencing the most comfortable life of any human group in all of recorded history, right? Whereas when you go out into realms of suffering, not whether back into the past, where obviously like even a toothache was this, nightmare of epic proportions, or just into realms like, realms of chronic illness, realms of sort of persistent addiction and suffering in our own society, you find a lot more people for whom the problem of evil isn't really it's not what they're worrying about, right? They're trying to lean on God to get them through suffering. And I think you do have to weigh that reality. Again, it's not a proof of anything, but in the balance of figuring out, is this a good reason not to believe? Is this a good reason not to practice? And if the people who are suffering the most don't seem to regard it as one, then maybe you, the comfortable reader, should not regard it as such either.
My last question is how would encourage people to deal with doubt? And maybe this is the fundamentalist Pentecostal upbringing in me, but I think about like becoming Catholic. I think one reason I couldn't become Catholic is because according to the Catholic system itself, you have to basically believe everything. So I don't think that I could like say, well, I affirm 100% of what's in the catechism of the Catholic Church. Of course, cradle Catholics don't have that problem. They doubt things all the time. But like, how do you deal? How do you deal?
There's a lot of there's a lot of doubt in Catholicism.
How do we deal? How do we deal with this idea of like, man, if I can't like fully sign up to everything, or I have some questions about this, I shouldn't get in. How do we deal with the doubt?
Yeah,
issue?
I mean, this is an area where I have probably become more liberal over time, and in a way, this is in spite of arguing for the reality of the supernatural and all kinds of very trad coded things. This is in a way a more liberal book in certain ways, because my view is that everyone experiences doubts. I think that there are certain things that you should have less doubts about than others. As I think the ordering of the universe and the importance of the human place in it, I think there are very, very solid arguments for those things, right? I am arguing for for the reasonability of core beliefs here, and I think there's a similar reasonability to core beliefs in Christianity itself that I get to at the end of the book, but it isn't my primary purpose. But when it comes to very specific points of doctrine and dogma, the sometimes blurry, often blurry territory where orthodoxy becomes heresy and vice versa. I think you just have to accept that, if you're a thoughtful person who wrestles with these questions, you're going to have some gray areas in your own mind, right? And if those gray areas sort of change in way, there's a scale of doubt at which you probably should consider, being part of a different religion, right? I think that's and one thing I say in the book is that like if you're entering a religious path, you shouldn't assume that that's the only path you're going to be on. That maybe you're going to start on one path and move to another, right? So sometimes doubt is the engine of that kind of movement, taking you from the first place where you're exploring religion to the deeper place that you're going to explore religion. That could be the case. But if you're asking me, should Catholics remain in the pews, if they have, if there's something in the catechism that they have a lot of doubts about, I think the answer is clearly yes. And you too, can come home as a baptized Catholic anytime while retaining, some Jansenist perspectives, right, on free will and predestination. I don't know. This is I've been a critic of Pope Francis, but this can be my Pope Francis side coming out. I think that, and even I think that one thing that even just within Catholicism, I think that's become clear, just from the debates of the last 10 or 15 years that my church has been having, is that there is always a little more instability in doctrine than the most intense rigorists would like you to believe. And living with some of that instability while you're trying to make your way through a finite lifespan on Earth, where the most important thing is often your direct relationship with God, your family, your neighbors, and so on. I think that should keep you attached to the religious tradition that you think God has placed you in, even if you have, a certain degree of uncertainty around the edges. I saw someone, this I'm forgetting whether it was on Substack or might have been a Substack essay recently, but it was by someone who was who had decided they couldn't become a Catholic, or they had become a Catholic and had left the church because they didn't agree with the Catholic view of divine simplicity. And I don't want to say that the Catholic view of divine simplicity is in any way unimportant. And I think what, a serious Catholic theologian, if you had a good Dominican or Thomist, right, on this podcast, they would say, well, actually, the Catholic view of divine simplicity then informs these other areas of, more practical spiritual life and reality. Like all of that may be true. And yet I still read that and I was like, really? If I decided the church was wrong about divine simplicity, I would not leave the church. And, maybe there are certain things that I'm required to assent to belief in that I have not adequately investigated. And I just won't, anyway. So yeah, that's my pitch for, not cafeteria Catholicism, but a kind of remaining with institutions, even when you have complex thoughts about their teachings.
Well, with that, we will conclude. Again, my guest today has been Ross Douthat. He is the author of the book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. I think it's the subtitle. There's a link to buy that in the show notes. Ross, thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Aaron. It was a pleasure. I really appreciate it.